Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa, as you saw on your screen, announcing on Monday night the end of the national state of disaster. That means the easing of more restrictions after 750 days of lockdown. It was that long. We speak now to the futurist Graeme Codrington from Today, Tomorrow Global, and how we should be facing the future. Graeme, good afternoon to you. It is a sign of the times that you're actually in the studio. Thank you for coming in. It seems difficult to know what's going to happen next. The optimists, my mother says I am one, are going to say that we might get back to what we used to call normal, face-to-face conversations. In China right now, millions of people in Shanghai are under a lockdown.
Well, exactly, and I think that's what people have to understand, that the removal of that label, state of disaster, doesn't mean COVID's over. Millions of people in China are under lockdown. The UK is seeing a massive surge, and there are real-life implications. So earlier this week on Monday, 113 flights were cancelled at Heathrow, most of them because crew members were sick. Woke up in the morning, did one of those rapid tests, said, oh, I've got COVID. Sorry, boss, I can't come in. Sorry, passengers, we're not flying today. So we mustn't think that the disruption is over. Some of the restrictions are over, but we're going to have to learn to live with COVID.
There are also, I suppose, effects from the pandemic that we're not aware of yet. And I realize that sounds silly, but things accumulate. There are effects that accumulate. So there might be some global good, let's say, I don't know, aluminium or copper or something, that's had a huge supply chain disruption. You might not be able to buy a solar panel in a year's time because of these disruptions.
Well, we remember the great toilet paper rush of 2 years ago in March 2020, when we suddenly realized quite a lot of the world's toilet paper comes from countries that were locking down, and that might influence us. We've got that same problem again. These 50 million Chinese people who lock down, what do they make? As you say, a few weeks' time we'll find out, because it's not going to arrive on our shores. And of course there's further disruptions in supply chains from other things going on, like a war in Ukraine. And there, I was surprised to discover, I think you discovered it as well, that Ukraine supplies much of the world's sunflower oil. So if we see sunflower oil increasing in price or even disappearing off our shelves, it could be because of something happening on the far distant side of the world. And that, for me, is one of the biggest things that people have to understand. Celebrate the fact that we're out of the state of disaster. Keep yourself very alert for the disruptions that are still coming our way.
You mentioned international travel. In fact, if I understand correctly, you have recently been out of the country. I don't know what that's like. It's been so long. But, I mean, international travel is one of the... It's a sort of key symptom. It's a warning signal. If you see lots of disruption, you know there are going to be disruptions to other things. I mean, I don't know if the travel industry, the tourism industry, are going to be what they used to be.
I wonder whether some industries may never go back to the way that they were. We hope that tourism for leisure comes back quickly. Obviously, in South Africa, that's a huge industry for us. But business travel, I'm pretty certain, is going to be impacted for years, maybe forever. Because, of course, the next conversation is about climate change and carbon footprints. And business people that have now realized, maybe I don't have to go to that international meeting every month. Maybe I can go once a quarter. Or maybe I don't go once a quarter, I go once a year. I think those types of calculations are going to now remain forever. We'll meet each other more than we have done during lockdown, but maybe not as much as we used to before lockdowns.
It just starts the conversation about working from home, you know, and I mean, some people enjoy it, some people don't, but Officer Stanton still is, you know, doesn't have nearly the number of people it used to have.
I think that's going to be one of the biggest lasting legacies, and I think companies are making a big mistake. A lot of companies are picking I call it a random number, but they're saying you have to come back to the office 3 days a week, 2 days a week, 1 day a week. And as much as I understand the sentiment, you want to get people back together. There's a sense that things happen when people are in the same room together. I think if you just choose a random number, say 3 days a week, and don't have the conversation about under what conditions will we do our best work, I think we're missing something that we could learn from COVID. We've learned to deal with disruption. We've learned that many people can work from home. And I think now the question has to be, where will you do your best work? Some days you come to the office, some days you stay at home, some weeks you come to the office, some weeks you don't need to. And I think it's going to need to be constant adaptability in the future, rather than just a new policy set in stone. adaptability is probably a key word here.
So interesting, because some things might seem like a really good idea in the short term. It might seem like for 3 years, let's all stay at home. Over the long term, you might find that people actually turn out to be lonely. They turn out to actually be less happy. It turns out that people do enjoy working together in a team, seeing each other, and that's really hard to assess. So you might find that people are less productive, but you can't work out why.
That's an interesting point. I remember a consultant explaining to me that he spends most of his life helping centralized companies decentralize, and then the other half of his life helping decentralized companies centralize. And his thesis was that it's that state of change that's actually the best place to be in. That as soon as you find yourself in a space where you fix your policies and your systems, you're immediately on the back foot. And maybe that's going to be what this new hybrid world is like. We've been locked down and locked away from each other for 2 years. We're going to rush back to in-person meetings and conferences. We're going to have forgotten how dreary some conference venues are and how bad the office coffee is. And so we're going to overcompensate in the one direction and then maybe find I don't, in fact, think we will find a solution. I think we will find that the constant flux, the constant, let's do some work from home now, let's do some work from a coffee shop tomorrow, let's do some work from the office. I think that's where a lot of people are going to end up. Obviously, it's not for everybody. If you, working at a restaurant, you don't get to be as flexible as you might if you're an accountant, for example. But I think those people who can get flexibility will certainly want it.
For the last 3 years, the pandemic's been the dominant trend in our society. Every time we spoke to you on the Pulse, it was about the pandemic. If it does recede, and let's put China to one side, you can never put China to one side, but let's for a moment. Could the big dynamic going forward be Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the disruption that that's led to? And for most people, I think, an unexpected disruption.
Well, I think it was only unexpected if you weren't concentrating.
Sure.
Similar to COVID, actually. A lot of people talk about the black swan events, the concept of the fact that all swans are white until you find this one black swan somewhere, which is unexpected and unpredictable. Except it's not. I like to think of them more as grey elephants sitting in the corner of the room, waiting to be noticed. And, Putin has been talking about re-establishing the Russian Empire before he was president. The concept of multipolarity is something that Gorbachev's vice president and foreign minister was talking about. Multipolarity meaning that Russia, and their hope was China and India would join them in creating a balance to American power. So you wouldn't just have the single source of power in the world, but this multipolar. So Putin's been talking about this for a long time. Yes, maybe a surprise that he invaded Ukraine just after the end of the Chinese Olympics, of course. He waited for them. So that might be a surprise. But that Putin wants to establish Russia as a superpower again, that he wants to expand the borders, not so much of a surprise. And for me, Stephen, I think that's where a lot of businesses need to start focusing their attention now, is what are some of the, let's call them the elephants in the room that are there. And that would include things like aging populations and demographic shifts. It would include global inequality and wealth gaps. It would include, obviously, climate change. But there are some big things that maybe we think we've talked out and we've talked enough that we can ignore them until suddenly they emerge and disrupt the world scene like Russia has done in Ukraine.
You and I are, I think, roughly the same age. I won't ask how old you are. And our era, let's call it from the time that we became sort of economically active, from just after 1990, say, from probably the end of the Cold War until probably 2020, was 30 years of globalization, the big era of globalization, the liberalization of China, the fact that the Chinese economy growing, perhaps the most important thing that was happening in the world apart from globalization, the fact that the certain phone was designed in California and made in China, the fact that another phone was made in South Korea and China, two former enemies, very interesting. Is globalization over? Is this period of globalization over?
I think as we know it, it is, yes. And I actually think in this case, Putin is right, that multipolarity is the future, that the world is now breaking into these big dominant players. And the players all want a seat at the table. They don't want America to dominate. They don't want the dollar to dominate global economy. And I think that's why China is just remaining a little bit neutral at the moment, playing all sides. To be honest, I think that's what our president in South Africa is doing as well, is just let's see how this plays out rather than picking our teams too early. And I think what will emerge is not an end of globalization, but I think there'll be a much stronger regionalization emerging. And that means conversations around SADC and around the African Union might be way more important than they were just a few years ago as we begin to look at how the world shapes out. So globalization is not over. The world is interconnected and will remain so. But I think it will find a different shape over the next few years, no doubt.
Graeme Codrington, nice to see you in person on the Pulse. Thank you very much indeed from Today, Tomorrow Global.